Welcome. This is part 2 of the BCBA 6th edition quick study guide walkthrough. Part 1 built the foundation: concepts, measurement, design, and ethics. Part 2 is where those words have to become decisions. Keep the free PDF open while watching. You can get it at bcbmockexam.com on the BCBA 6th edition study guide page. Use this video as the teaching layer. For every page, listen for the conflict. What close answer choice could steal the point, and what phrase in the stem should control your decision? Start with the Part 2 route. Domains F through I: test, judgment, assessment, procedures, intervention, fit, and supervision. The dangerous part is that many answer choices sound professionally reasonable. So before reading every answer choice, identify the controlling phrase in the stem. Then separate the closest concept pair. If you miss the same pair twice, comment that pair so we know where to slow down next. Here is the map of the lesson. We will move through assessment, procedures, intervention, and supervision. Then we will do the confusion drills, because that is where many candidates lose points after they already know the definitions. The goal is not to memorize all 61 modules today. The goal is to build a repeatable exam move, define the concept, locate the controlling phrase, rule out the close alternative, then choose. Now we move into Domain F, assessment. This section covers FBA, descriptive assessment, functional analysis, and validity. The page itself gives you the guideline. The video has to do something more. It has to show why a candidate might choose the wrong neighboring concept. So for this section, keep asking, what is the decision point? What is the evidence, and what would make the tempting answer wrong? Functional behavior assessment. FBA is the whole problem-solving process, not one form. A tempting wrong answer is treating interview data, ABC data, or an FA as if any one of them equals the entire assessment. In plain English, it means a process for identifying variables that maintain behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Interview, ABC data, and analysis suggest aggression is escape maintained. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to identifying function before treatment. Hold on to this version. Define, measure, hypothesize, test when needed. Indirect assessment. Indirect assessment is secondhand information. It is useful for hypotheses, but the trap is treating reports as if they were direct evidence. In plain English, it means information gathered from interviews, rating scales, or records rather than direct observation. Here is how that shows up in practice. A teacher completes a FAST or interview about tantrums. The decision point is practical. Separate report, observation, and experimental test before deciding how confident the function is. The clue is reports from others. If you need one line, use this. Someone tells you about behavior. Before moving on, ask whether someone reported the information instead of the behavior being directly observed. Descriptive assessment. Descriptive assessment watches what happens naturally. A common wrong turn is treating a natural pattern as if it proved the function. In plain English, it means direct observation of behavior and environmental events without manipulating variables. Here is how that shows up in practice. Observer records ABC data during normal classroom routines. This is where the close answer choices separate. The stem has to give you observation in natural conditions. That gives you the quick version. Watch what happens naturally. Functional analysis. Functional analysis tests function by arranging conditions. A common wrong turn is forgetting that stronger evidence also requires planning, safeguards, and ethical judgment. In plain English, it means systematic manipulation of antecedents and consequences to test function. Here is how that shows up in practice. Attention, escape, tangible, alone, and control conditions are compared. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to manipulated conditions and experimental test of function, use that detail to decide. The short rule is, test the function, do not just infer it. Antecedent. An antecedent comes before the behavior. A common wrong turn is calling the antecedent the maintaining variable when the consequence is doing the maintaining. In plain English, it means an event or stimulus that occurs before behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. A demand is presented before problem behavior. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to what happens before. Hold on to this version. What came right before? Before moving on, ask what happened immediately before the behavior, then separately ask what followed it. Setting event. A setting event is broader background context, not the immediate trigger. A common wrong turn is mixing up distant variables with what happened right before the response. In plain English, it means a broader context that changes how antecedents and consequences affect behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Poor sleep increases problem behavior during demands later that day. The decision point is practical. Separate report, observation, and experimental test before deciding how confident the function is. The clue is distant or contextual variables. If you need one line, use this. Background conditions change sensitivity. 8BC data. 8BC data records the sequence around behavior. A common wrong turn is seeing a pattern and jumping straight to certainty about function. In plain English, it means recording antecedent, behavior, and consequence around each occurrence. Here is how that shows up in practice. Demand, screaming, work removed is documented across episodes. This is where the close answer choices is separate. The stem has to give you ABC sequence. That gives you the quick version, before, behavior, after. Operational definition. In assessment, the conflict is scoring. If two observers cannot apply the definition the same way, the rest of the data become weak. In plain English, it means clear, objective definition of behavior, so observers agree. Here is how that shows up in practice. Aggression means hitting, kicking, biting, or throwing objects within 3 feet. What can mislead you is angry, disruptive, and non-compliant are not enough. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to observable, measurable, included and excluded examples, use that detail to decide. The short rule is define it so two observers score the same event. Before moving on, ask whether another observer could score it without guessing what the writer meant. Preference assessment. In assessment, the conflict is liked versus effective. Preference tells you what may work. Reinforcer assessment tests whether behavior actually increases. In plain English, it means procedure to identify likely preferred stimuli. Here is how that shows up in practice. MSWO shows bubbles selected first across trials. The part to be careful with is this. Preference is not proof of reinforcement. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to identifying possible reinforcers. Hold on to this version. What might function as a reinforcer? Reinforcer assessment. In assessment, the conflict is liked versus effective. Preference tells you what may work. Reinforcer assessment tests whether behavior actually increases. In plain English, it means procedure to test whether a stimulus increases future behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Work output increases when tokens are delivered contingent on completion. A common wrong turn is a liked item is not a reinforcer unless behavior increases. The decision point is practical. Separate report, observation, and experimental test before deciding how confident the function is. The clue is effect on future behavior. If you need one line, use this. Did it strengthen behavior? Social validity. Social validity is about whether the goals, procedures, and outcomes are meaningful and acceptable to the people affected. For example, a behavior plan may reduce problem behavior on the graph, but the family may also need to say whether the routine fits home life and whether the outcome matters to them. The part candidates can miss is that social validity is not the same as effectiveness. Outcome data still matter. Social validity adds the stakeholder value question. It does not replace the data. So when a STEM talks about acceptability, feasibility, values, satisfaction, or whether the change matters in real life, you should be thinking about social validity. A short way to hold it is this. Does this work, and does it matter and fit for the people affected? Now we move into Domain G, Procedures. This section covers skill acquisition, prompts, differential reinforcement, and reduction. The page itself gives you the guideline. The video has to do something more. It has to show why a candidate might choose the wrong neighboring concept. So for this section, keep asking, what is the decision point? What is the evidence? And what would make the tempting answer wrong? Shaping. Shaping is about building one response form gradually. A tempting wrong answer is calling every multi-step skill shaping, when chaining is the better match. In plain English, it means reinforcing successive approximations toward a terminal behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Reinforce touching a toothbrush, then holding it, then brushing teeth. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to gradual changes in one response form. Hold on to this version. Change the form little by little. Task analysis. Task analysis is the blueprint. A common wrong turn is confusing the written step list with the teaching procedure used to move through that list. In plain English, it means breaking a complex skill into teachable component steps. Here is how that shows up in practice. Hand washing is split into turning water on, wetting hands, applying soap, etc. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is step-by-step sequence. If you need one line, use this, break the skill into steps. Before moving on, if the answer only breaks the skill into steps, it is task analysis. If it teaches movement through those steps, look for chaining. Forward chaining. Forward chaining starts where the learner starts. The question usually turns on which step is taught independently first. In plain English, it means teaching the first step first, then adding later steps. Here is how that shows up in practice. Learner independently turns on water, then is prompted through the rest. The part to be careful with is this. Useful when natural sequence starts with a motivating first action. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The stem has to give you first step mastered first. That gives you the quick version. Start at step 1. Backward chaining. Backward chaining starts near the terminal reinforcer. A common wrong turn is missing why the last step can be motivating for some learners. In plain English, it means teaching the last step first with prompts for earlier steps. Here is how that shows up in practice. Learner completes the final hand-washing step and contacts natural reinforcement. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to last step mastered first, use that detail to decide. The short rule is finish the chain first. Total task chaining. Total task chaining works when the whole sequence can be practiced with support. A common wrong turn is treating every chain as one step at a time teaching. In plain English, it means teaching every step in the chain during each teaching opportunity. Here is how that shows up in practice. Learner practices all hand-washing steps with prompts as needed. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to all steps taught every trial. Hold on to this version. Practice the whole chain each time. Before moving on, ask whether the whole routine is practiced each time, with help as needed across the chain. Discrete trial teaching. DTT is a teaching format. Clear cue, response, consequence, and a short interval before the next trial. A common wrong turn is treating it as a principle by itself. In plain English, it means structured teaching with clear SD, response, consequence, and inter-trial interval. Here is how that shows up in practice. Instructor says touch red. Learner responds. Consequence delivered. Next trial begins. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is structured repeated trials. If you need one line, use this. SD, response, consequence, reset. Response prompt. A response prompt helps the learner make the response. A tempting wrong answer is confusing help to respond with a change to the stimulus itself. In plain English, it means a prompt that helps the learner perform the response. Here is how that shows up in practice. Physical guidance helps a learner zip a code. This is where the close answer choices separate. The STEM has to give you assistance with the response itself. That gives you the quick version, help with doing the behavior. Stimulus prompt. A stimulus prompt changes the cue or materials so the correct response is more likely. A common wrong turn is forgetting that the prompt must fade back to natural control. In plain English, it means a prompt that changes the stimulus to make the correct response more likely. Here is how that shows up in practice. The correct picture is made larger or highlighted. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to altering the antecedent stimulus, use that detail to decide. The short rule is make the right stimulus stand out. Before moving on, ask whether the prompt changes the stimulus or cue and whether natural control is planned. Most to least prompting. Most to least prompting starts with more help and then systematically fades it. A common wrong turn is choosing it only because it sounds supportive, not because the error cost is high. In plain English, it means start with more intrusive prompts and fade to less intrusive prompts. Here is how that shows up in practice. Begin with full physical guidance, then partial physical, then gesture. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First, ask whether the STEM is pointing to decreasing prompt intrusiveness across teaching. Hold on to this version. Start strong, fade down. Least to most prompting. Least to most prompting starts with an opportunity for independence before more help is added. A common wrong turn is using it when repeated errors would be costly. In plain English, it means start with the least intrusive prompt and increase only as needed. Here is how that shows up in practice. Wait for independent response, then gesture, then model, then physical prompt. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is increasing assistance after errors or no response. If you need one line, use this. Give the learner a chance first. Errorless learning. Errorless learning arranges support, so errors are unlikely during acquisition. A common wrong turn is thinking it means the learner never works or never faces challenge. In plain English, it means arranging prompts and fading to minimize errors during acquisition. Here is how that shows up in practice. Immediate prompt prevents incorrect responding. Then prompt is systematically faded. This is where the close answer choices is separate. The STEM has to give you preventing errors and transferring control. That gives you the quick version. Build correct responding before practicing mistakes. Before moving on, look for plan support that prevents practice of errors during acquisition. Time delay. Time delay is about transferring stimulus control by inserting a wait before the prompt. A common wrong turn is confusing it with delaying reinforcement. In plain English, it means using a delay between SD and prompt to transfer stimulus control. Here is how that shows up in practice. Teacher says point to cup, waits 0 seconds at first, then 2 seconds before prompting. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to a prompt delayed after the instruction or natural cue, use that detail to decide. The short rule is wait before helping so the natural cue can take control. D or A means differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. In plain English, you're not only trying to reduce the problem behavior, you're making a better response work for the learner. Picture a learner who screams to escape difficult work. If you teach the learner to ask for a break, and that break request is reinforced, the new request can compete with screaming. The part candidates often miss is function. The alternative response should usually get the same need met. If screaming produced escape, the replacement response needs to produce appropriate escape, help, or a workable version of that same outcome. So when a question describes a better response being reinforced, ask one more question before choosing DRA. Does that better response actually work for the same function? A short way to say it is this. Reinforce a better way to get the same need met. D or O reinforces the absence of the target behavior for a period of time. A common wrong turn is forgetting it does not teach a specific replacement response. In plain English, it means reinforce absence of target behavior for a period of time. Here is how that shows up in practice. Deliver reinforcement if no aggression occurs for 5 minutes. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is no occurrence of the behavior. If you need one line, use this. Reinforce not doing the target behavior. Before moving on, ask whether the criterion is no target behavior during the interval. DRI. DRI is differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. It is related to DRA, but it is more specific. You are reinforcing a replacement behavior that cannot physically happen at the same time as the problem behavior. For example, if hitting is the target behavior, reinforcing hands and pockets can be DRI because hands and pockets and hitting cannot occur together. The common wrong turn is to call every alternative response DRI. A replacement can be appropriate without being incompatible. The question has to give you that physical cannot do both relation. A short way to hold it is this. DRI means the replacement blocks the problem response. DRL is for behavior that is acceptable at lower rates. A common wrong turn is treating it like a procedure for eliminating behavior completely. In plain English, it means reinforce lower rates of behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Reinforce asking questions fewer than 5 times during a lesson. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to reducing but not eliminating behavior, use that detail to decide. The short rule is less often, not 0. DRH. DRH builds higher rates of a desired behavior. A common wrong turn is choosing it when the problem is too much behavior, not too little. In plain English, it means reinforce higher rates of behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Reinforce reading more words per minute. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First, ask whether the stem is pointing to increasing response rate. Hold on to this version, more often or faster. Before moving on, ask whether the goal is to increase a low-rate desirable behavior. Functional communication training. FCT teaches a communication response that accesses the same reinforcer. A common wrong turn is picking a polite phrase that does not actually work for the same function. In plain English, it means teach a communicative response that replaces problem behavior and accesses the same reinforcer. Here is how that shows up in practice. Teach break, please to replace escape maintained aggression. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is communication as replacement behavior. If you need one line, use this. Teach communication that works better than problem behavior. Response cost. Response cost removes a specific amount of a reinforcer after behavior. A common wrong turn is missing the negative punishment relation because the word cost sounds informal. In plain English, it means loss of a reinforcer contingent on behavior. Here's how that shows up in practice. A token is removed after rule violation. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The stem has to give you losing tokens, points, or privileges after behavior. That gives you the quick version. Behavior costs a reinforcer. Timeout. Timeout removes access to reinforcement for a period of time. A common wrong turn is choosing it when the time-in setting is not actually reinforcing. In plain English, it means loss of access to reinforcement for a period following behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. A child is removed from a reinforcing activity after aggression. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to remove from reinforcement, not simply place somewhere else, use that detail to decide. The short rule is remove access to reinforcement briefly and ethically. Before moving on, ask whether the learner is removed from access to reinforcement. Overcorrection. Overcorrection requires the learner to correct or practice beyond the original error. A common wrong turn is ignoring intrusiveness and least restrictive alternatives. In plain English, It means following problem behavior with restitution or positive practice beyond simple correction. Here is how that shows up in practice. After throwing materials, learner restores area and practices appropriate placement. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to correcting effects plus extra practice. Hold on to this version. Repair and practice, not just apologize. Token economy. A token economy works only if tokens have exchange value. A common wrong turn is treating tokens as magic instead of conditioned reinforcers backed by rules and backup items. In plain English, it means conditioned reinforcers earned for behavior and exchange for backup reinforcers. Here is how that shows up in practice. Tokens are earned for task completion in exchange for activities. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is tokens plus exchange system. If you need one line, use this, earn symbolic value, exchange for backup value. Contingency contract. A contingency contract makes the behavior, criterion, and consequence explicit. A common wrong turn is writing a vague promise instead of a measurable agreement. In plain English, it means written agreement specifying behavior, consequences, and criteria. Here is how that shows up in practice. Student earns game time for completing homework listed in a contract. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The stem has to give you written if-then agreement. That gives you the quick version. Put the contingency in writing. Before moving on, ask whether the contract states behavior, criterion, and consequence in measurable terms. Non-contingent reinforcement. NCR delivers reinforcement on a time-based schedule, not contingent on the problem behavior. A common wrong turn is forgetting to thin and monitor behavior change. In plain English, it means deliver reinforcement on a time-based schedule independent of behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Attention is provided every 2 minutes regardless of problem behavior. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to time-based access, not dependent on target behavior, use that detail to decide. The short rule is deliver the reinforcer before problem behavior has to ask for it. Behavioral momentum. Behavioral momentum uses easier responses before a harder request. A common wrong turn is treating high-P requests as a substitute for function-based treatment. In plain English, it means use a sequence of high-probability requests before a low-probability request. Here is how that shows up in practice. Ask touch head, clap hands, high five, then start worksheet. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to high-P sequence. Hold on to this version. Build response momentum before the harder ask. Modeling. Modeling shows the target performance. A common wrong turn is assuming watching is enough when imitation or practice support is missing. In plain English, it means demonstrating the target behavior for the learner to imitate. Here is how that shows up in practice. Instructor shows how to raise a hand before asking the learner to do it. The decision point is practical. Name what the procedure builds, reduces, replaces, or transfers, then ask whether it matches function. The clue is demonstration before response. If you need one line, use this, show the response. Before moving on, ask whether the learner can imitate or whether modeling needs rehearsal and feedback. Now we move into Domain H, Intervention. This section covers function-based plans, replacement behavior, treatment integrity, and social validity. The page itself gives you the guideline. The video has to do something more. It has to show why a candidate might choose the wrong neighboring concept. So for this section, keep asking, what is the decision point? What is the evidence? And what would make the tempting answer wrong? Function-based intervention. In intervention, the conflict is topography versus function. Do not choose a treatment just because the behavior looks severe. Choose from what maintains it. In plain English, it means intervention selected based on a maintaining function of behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Escape behavior is addressed with demand fading, FCT for breaks, and reinforcement for task completion. A common wrong turn is topography alone should not drive treatment selection. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to treatment matched to function, use that detail to decide. The short rule is treat the function, not just the form. Antécédent intervention. In intervention, the conflict is prevention versus consequence. Changing what comes before can help, but it still has to connect to function and teaching. In plain English, it means changing events before behavior to reduce problem behavior or support success. Here is how that shows up in practice. Offer choices before work to reduce escape-maintain behavior. What can mislead you is antecedent strategies should still connect to function and teaching. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to prevention before the response occurs. Hold on to this version. Change the setup before behavior happens. Before moving on, can you explain how the intervention will work outside the training setting and over time? Replacement behavior. In intervention, the conflict is nice behavior versus useful behavior. A replacement must access the same need well enough to compete. In plain English, it means an appropriate behavior taught to serve the same function as the problem behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. Learn a request help instead of throwing materials to escape hard tasks. The part to be careful with is this. A nice behavior that does not meet the same need will not compete well. The decision point is practical. Connect the plan to function, fit, generalization, maintenance, and meaningful outcomes. The clue is functionally equivalent alternative. If you need one line, use this, teach what to do instead. Least intrusive effective intervention. In intervention, the conflict is gentle versus effective. Least intrusive does not mean weak. It means the least restrictive option that still works. In plain English, it means choose the lowest intrusion procedure likely to work given assessment and risk. Here is how that shows up in practice. Use FCT and reinforcement before restrictive punishment when safe and feasible. A common wrong turn is least intrusive still must be effective. This is where the close answer choices separate. The stem has to give you balancing effectiveness and restrictiveness. That gives you the quick version, low intrusion plus real effect. Contextual fit. In intervention, the conflict is elegant plan versus runnable plan. If the people and setting cannot support it, the plan may fail even if it is technically sound. In plain English, it means how well the plan fits the setting, people, resources, and routines. Here is how that shows up in practice. A parent plan uses materials already in the home and matches family schedule. What can mislead you is a beautiful plan with poor fit often fails. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the stem is pointing to feasibility, routines, resources, and implemental capacity, use that detail to decide. The short rule is, can this plan live in the real environment? Before moving on, can you explain how the intervention will work outside the training setting and over time? Treatment integrity. In intervention, the conflict is plan failure versus implementation failure. Poor outcomes may mean the plan was not run as written. In plain English, it means extent to which the intervention is implemented as written. Here is how that shows up in practice. Staff deliver prompts and reinforcement exactly as specified on 92% of opportunities. The part to be careful with is this. Poor integrity can explain weak outcomes. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First ask whether the stem is pointing to fidelity to the procedure. Hold on to this version. Did we run the plan correctly? Generalization. In intervention, the conflict is trained setting versus real life. Do not assume transfer happens automatically. In plain English, it means skill or behavior change occurs across people, settings, materials, or responses. Here is how that shows up in practice. A man taught with one therapist occurs with parents and teachers. A common wrong turn is planned for it. Do not hope it happens. The decision point is practical. Connect the plan to function, fit, generalization, maintenance, and meaningful outcomes. The clue is transfer beyond teaching conditions. If you need one line, use this. Does the skill show up elsewhere? Maintenance. In intervention, the conflict is immediate gain versus durability. You need to know whether the behavior lasts after time passes or supports fade. In plain English, it means behavior change continues after intervention is reduced or time passes. Here is how that shows up in practice. A learner still uses coping skills 2 months after daily teaching stops. What can mislead you as maintenance is time-based. Generalization is context-based. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The STEM has to give you durability over time. That gives you the quick version. Does it last? Before moving on, can you explain how the intervention will work outside the training setting and over time? Behavioral cusp. In intervention, the conflict is improvement versus new access. A cusp opens new environments, contingencies, and learning opportunities. In plain English, it means a behavior change that exposes the learner to new environments, reinforcers, or contingencies. Here is how that shows up in practice. Learning to read opens access to books, school tasks, and independent learning. The part to be careful with is this. A cusp changes the client's world. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to access to new learning opportunities, use that detail to decide. The short rule is, this skill opens doors. Pivotal behavior. In intervention, the conflict is one target versus many collateral changes. Pivotal behavior creates broad effects across other behavior. In plain English, it means a behavior that produces widespread positive changes in other behaviors. Here is how that shows up in practice. Increasing motivation or initiations improves many learning opportunities. A common wrong turn is pivotal behavior changes many behaviors. Cusp opens new environments or contingencies. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First, ask whether the STEM is pointing to broad collateral effects. Hold on to this version. Change one key behavior, many things improve. Outcome, social validity. In intervention, the conflict is graph movement versus meaningful change. The outcome has to matter to stakeholders. In plain English, it means stakeholders judge whether the change was meaningful and acceptable. Here is how that shows up in practice. Family says bedtime routine is now manageable and worth the effort. The trap is easier to see if you say it negatively. Do not measure only behavior if the outcome does not matter to stakeholders. The decision point is practical. Connect the plan to function, fit, generalization, maintenance, and meaningful outcomes. The clue is satisfaction with results. If you need one line, use this. Did the outcome matter to the people living with it? Before moving on, can you explain how the intervention will work outside the training setting and over time? Now we move into Domain I, Supervision. This section covers BST, feedback, fidelity, OBM, and delegation. The page itself gives you the guideline. The video has to do something more. It has to show why a candidate might choose the wrong neighboring concept. So for this section, keep asking, what is the decision point? What is the evidence? And what would make the tempting answer wrong? Behavioral skills training. BST is not a lecture. A tempting wrong answer is calling training complete before instruction, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback all appear. In plain English, it means instruction, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback used together to teach skills. Here is how that shows up in practice. Train staff to run DTT by explaining, demonstrating, practicing, and correcting. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to all 4 components, use that detail to decide. The short rule is tell, show, practice, feedback. Instruction. Instruction tells the person what to do. A common wrong turn is treating telling as proof that the person can perform. In plain English, it means the explain component of BST. Here is how that shows up in practice. Supervisor describes each step of the prompting procedure. When you read the answer choices, do not start with the label. First, ask whether the STEM is pointing to verbal or written description. Hold on to this version. Explain the performance expectation. Before moving on, can you tell whether the trainee has demonstrated competence, not just heard instructions? Modeling in BST. Modeling shows the skill. A common wrong turn is stopping at demonstration without checking whether the trainee can do it. In plain English, it means the trainer demonstrates the correct performance. Here is how that shows up in practice. Supervisor demonstrates the prompt and reinforcement sequence. The decision point is practical. Look for observable staff performance, competency checks, fidelity data, and feedback loops. The clue is demonstration by trainer. If you need one line, use this. Show exactly what correct looks like. Rehearsal. Rehearsal is where the trainee actually practices the skill. A common wrong turn is assuming understanding equals performance. In plain English, it means the trainee practices the skill. Here is how that shows up in practice. Staff role play running a teaching trial. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The STEM has to give you practice opportunities. That gives you the quick version, practice before real implementation. Feedback. Feedback changes performance when it is specific and actionable. A common wrong turn is vague praise that does not tell the trainee what to keep or change. In plain English, it means performance-specific praise and correction after rehearsal or implementation. Here is how that shows up in practice. Supervisor says reinforcement was immediate. Next time, fade the prompt faster. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to specific performance correction, use that detail to decide. The short rule is, tell what worked and what to change. Before moving on, can you tell whether the trainee has demonstrated competence, not just heard instructions? Performance feedback. Performance feedback uses data or observation to improve work behavior. A common wrong turn is feedback that is too delayed, too vague, or disconnected from performance. In plain English, it means ongoing feedback based on observed work performance and data. Here is how that shows up in practice. Supervisor reviews fidelity data and gives immediate coaching. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First, ask whether the STEM is pointing to data-based feedback in supervision. Hold on to this version. Coach from observed behavior. Competency-based training. Competency-based training requires demonstrated performance to criterion. A common wrong turn is counting attendance as competence. In plain English, it means training continues until the person demonstrates objective mastery. Here is how that shows up in practice. Staff must reach 90% fidelity across 2 sessions before independent implementation. The decision point is practical. Look for observable staff performance, competency checks, fidelity data, and feedback loops. The clue is mastery criteria. If you need one line, use this. Prove the skill, do not just attend the training. Fidelity monitoring. Fidelity monitoring asks whether the plan was implemented as written. A common wrong turn is blaming the plan before checking implementation. In plain English, it means checking whether procedures are implemented as designed. Here is how that shows up in practice. A checklist scores each step of the protocol during sessions. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The STEM has to give you implementation accuracy. That gives you the quick version. Measure the plan being run. Before moving on, can you tell whether the trainee has demonstrated competence, not just heard instructions? Organizational behavior management. OBM applies behavior principles to workplace performance. A common wrong turn is forgetting that staff behavior is still behavior. In plain English, it means applying behavior principles to workplace performance. Here is how that shows up in practice. A clinic improves session note completion with prompts, feedback, and reinforcement. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to staff performance, systems, workplace contingencies, use that detail to decide. The short rule is ABA for workplace performance. Self-monitoring. Self-monitoring lets the person track their own performance. A common wrong turn is assuming self-recorded data are always accurate without support or checks. In plain English, it means the performer records or checks their own behavior. Here is how that shows up in practice. A staff member tracks whether they delivered reinforcement within 3 seconds. When you read the answer choices, do not start with a label. First, ask whether the STEM is pointing to self-recording or self-checking. Hold on to this version. The person measures their own behavior. Supervision contract. A supervision contract clarifies expectations. A common wrong turn is treating the document as a replacement for active supervision. In plain English, it means agreement outlining responsibilities, expectations, and supervision conditions. Here is how that shows up in practice. Supervisor and trainee document fieldwork expectations and feedback schedule. The decision point is practical. Look for observable staff performance, competency checks, fidelity data, and feedback loops. The clue is written supervision expectations. If you need one line, use this. Define the supervision relationship. Before moving on, can you tell whether the trainee has demonstrated competence, not just her instructions? Pyramidal training. Pyramidal training uses trained people to train others. A common wrong turn is letting errors multiply because quality was not monitored. In plain English, it means a small group is trained to train others. Here is how that shows up in practice. BCBA trains lead therapists who then train new staff using BST. This is where the close answer choice is separate. The STEM has to give you train-the-trainer structure. That gives you the quick version. Training flows through tiers. Delegation. Delegation assigns tasks, not responsibility. A common wrong turn is thinking the BCBA is no longer accountable. In plain English, it means assigning tasks only to people competent to perform them with appropriate oversight. Here is how that shows up in practice. A technician collects data after training and competency checks. So in an exam item, let the wording guide you. If the STEM is pointing to assigning tasks, competence, and supervision, use that detail to decide. The short rule is delegate with competence and oversight. Confusion drills. This is where the video should slow down. At this point, knowing a definition is not enough. For each pair, listen for one mini case, one tempting wrong answer, and one memory line. The goal is to make the close distinction automatic before you see the answer choices. Now compare M, O, and SD. The real difference is not whether stimulus is present. The difference is value versus availability. Picture a student who has not had a break all morning and then sees the break card on the desk. The long time without a break makes the break more valuable. That is the MO side. The break card signals that asking for a break can work right now. That is the SD side. This is where candidates get pulled off track. They see a cue in the scene and immediately choose SD, even though the question may be asking about why the consequence matters more in that moment. So listen to the controlling phrase. If the STEM is about value, need, deprivation, satiation, or effort, think MO. If it is about reinforcement, being available for a response right now, think SD. A short way to hold it is this. MO changes how much the consequence matters. SD signals that the response can work. Now compare preference assessment versus reinforcer assessment. The real conflict is liked versus behavior strengthening. Picture the case. A learner chooses a tablet first, but math responses only increase when drawing time follows correct work. Choosing the tablet shows preference. Increased responding after drawing time shows reinforcement. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is assuming a preferred item is automatically a reinforcer. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Preference says may work. Reinforcer assessment says did strengthen behavior. Now compare functional analysis versus descriptive assessment. The real conflict is manipulation versus observation. Picture the case. ABC data shows screaming often follows demands, but a separate test compares escape, attention, tangible, alone, and control conditions. The ABC record is descriptive. The arranged comparison is functional analysis. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is treating patterns in natural observation as proof of function. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Descriptive observes. Functional analysis tests. Now compare topography versus function. The real conflict is form versus payoff. Picture the case. One learner hits to escape work. Another learner hits to get peer attention. The topography is the same, hitting. The functions are different because the maintaining consequences differ. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is choosing intervention from what the behavior looks like. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A sure way to hold it is this. Topography is what it looks like. Function is what it gets or avoids. Now compare behavioral cusp versus pivotal behavior. The real conflict is new access versus broad collateral change. Picture the case. Reading opens new learning environments. Improving imitation changes many later learning opportunities. Reading can be a cusp because it opens access. Imitation can be pivotal because it affects many other skills. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is using both words for any important skill. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Cusp opens doors. Pivotal changes many behaviors. Now compare generalization versus maintenance. The real conflict is elsewhere versus later. Picture the case. A learner uses the skill with a new teacher today, then still uses it 3 months later. New teacher or new setting points to generalization. Continue performance over time points to maintenance. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is calling all successful transfer generalization. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A sure way to hold it is this. Generalization crosses people, places, or materials. Maintenance crosses time. Now compare DRA versus DRI. The real conflict is better alternative versus physically incompatible response. Picture the case. A learner requests a break instead of screaming. Another learner keeps hands in pockets instead of hitting. Requesting a break is DRA if it is the better alternative. Hands in pockets is DRI because it cannot happen with hitting. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is calling every replacement response incompatible. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. DRA is better. DRI cannot happen at the same time. Now compare DRO versus DRL. The real conflict is 0 during the interval versus less often. Picture the case. Reinforcement follows 10 minutes with no interruptions, or reinforcement follows no more than 2 interruptions during class. No interruptions during the interval is DRO. Lower but not 0 rate is DRL. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is choosing DRO whenever the goal is reduction. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. DRO means none for now. DRL means less than before. Now compare prompting versus fading. The real conflict is help now versus transfer control. Picture the case. A teacher points to the correct bin, then over trials makes the point smaller and later removes it. The point is the prompt. The systematic removal is fading. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is calling any prompt change prompting without noticing transfer to the natural cue. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Prompting adds help. Fading removes help carefully. Now compare shaping versus chaining. The real conflict is one response changing versus many steps connecting. Picture the case. Speech sounds get closer to the target word, or toothbrushing steps are linked into a routine. Changing one response form is shaping. Linking component steps is chaining. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is calling gradual progress, shaping even when the skill is a sequence. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Shaping changes form. Chaining links steps. Now compare whole interval versus partial interval. The real conflict is strict all-interval scoring versus broad any-interval scoring. Picture the case. You score on task only if it lasts the full interval where you score problem behavior if it happens at any moment. Whole interval requires the full interval and tends to underestimate. Partial interval needs any occurrence and tends to overestimate. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is choosing by the behavior label instead of the scoring rule. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Whole means all. Partial means any. Now compare treatment integrity versus social validity. The real conflict is accurate implementation versus stakeholder value. Picture the case. Staff complete 92% of planned steps, but parents say the routine is too disruptive for home. The 92% is treatment integrity. The parent concern is social validity. This is where candidates get pulled off track. The tempting mistake is treating a correctly run plan as automatically acceptable. So when you choose, use the controlling phrase instead of the label that feels familiar. A short way to hold it is this. Integrity asks, was it done right? Social validity asks, does it matter and fit? Scenario rules. Applied questions are not asking what sounds helpful in general. They are asking for the next defensible step from the data, risk, function, ethics, and supervision context. For each scenario, notice the tempting move first. Then choose the answer that a careful BCBA could document. Now apply the rule to ethics first. Here is the situation. A parent asks you to start a new restrictive procedure tomorrow. A rushed answer jumps to the strongest treatment because the behavior sounds serious. That feels active, but it skips the decision path a BCB has to be able to defend. The better move is to slow the sequence down. Check consent, risk, least restrictive alternatives, scope, and documentation before acting. So the answer is not the fastest looking treatment. It is the next defensible step. A short way to hold it is this. When risk rises, ethics and documentation move with it. Now apply the rule to escape behavior. Here is the situation. Problem behavior happens during demands, and work is often removed afterward. A rushed candidate picks any consequence procedure that reduces behavior. The better move is to confirm the escape relation and teach an appropriate way to request a break or help while changing demand conditions. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest looking action. A short way to hold it is this. If work disappears after behavior, check escape before choosing treatment. Now apply the rule to attention behavior. Here is the situation. Behavior is followed by adult discussion, correction, or repeated reminders. A rushed candidate focuses only on the form of the behavior. The better move is to test whether attention maintains it and teach an appropriate attention request while changing adult responses. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest looking action. A short way to hold it is this. Correction can function as attention if it maintains behavior. Now apply the rule to automatic behavior. Here is the situation. A behavior happens alone and across settings, even when social consequences are limited. A rushed candidate assumes attention or escape because those are easier to see. The better move is to rule out medical and safety concerns, assess automatic reinforcement, and consider competing stimuli or replacement engagement. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest looking action. A short way to hold it is this. If social consequences do not explain it, assess automatic reinforcement carefully. Now apply the rule to measurement choice. Here is the situation. The target behavior varies by duration, rate, or whether it occurred at a moment in time. A rushed candidate chooses the measurement system they use most often. The better move is to match measurement to the behavior dimension and the decision you need to make. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest looking action. A short way to hold it is this. Measure the dimension that matters. Now apply the rule to treatment not working. Here is the situation. Data do not improve after a plan is introduced. A rushed candidate changes the whole plan immediately. The better move is to check treatment integrity, function match, reinforcement schedule, and data quality before deciding the plan failed. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest-looking action. A short way to hold it is this. Before replacing the plan, ask whether the plan actually happened. Now apply the rule to supervision issue. Here is the situation. A staff member says they understand the plan, but implementation is inconsistent. A rushed candidate gives another explanation and moves on. The better move is to use BST, observe performance, give specific feedback, and monitor fidelity to criterion. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest-looking action. A short way to hold it is this. Understanding is not the same as performance. Now apply the rule to mock review. Here is the situation. A candidate misses several mixed practice questions and wants to reread the whole guide. A rushed candidate reviews everything equally and feels busy. The better move is to classify the misses by concept pair, repair the weak rule, and then practice that pair again. So the answer should be the next defensible step, not the fastest-looking action. A short way to hold it is this. Do not just review more. Review the pattern that costs points. That completes Part 2 of the BCBA 6th edition Quick Study Guide walkthrough. The portable rule is to use the decision, not just the definition. In assessment, separate report, direct observation, and experimental testing before claiming function. For procedures and intervention, name what must change, then match the plan to function, context, generalization, and maintenance. In supervision, look for demonstrated competence, fidelity data, and specific feedback, not explanation or attendance alone. Define the concept, discriminate it from a closest alternative, apply it to the facts, and then check your answer against that closest alternative. Keep studying with our free BCBA mock exam and our free BCBA 6th edition quick study guide. Use the guide to review the concepts behind each miss. Then use a fresh mock exam to test whether the rule transfers to new question stems. Both complete links are shown on screen and included in the video description.